Chapter 21 of Aunt Jane's Nieces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patty Cunningham. Aunt Jane's Nieces by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 21. Reading the Will. Aunt Jane's funeral was extremely simple and quiet. The woman had made no friends during her long residence in the neighborhood, having isolated herself at the big house and refused to communicate in any way with the families living nearby. Therefore, although her death undoubtedly aroused much interest and comment, no one cared to be present at the obsequies. So the minister came from Elmwood, and being unable to say much that was good or bad of the woman who had departed from this vale of tears, he confined his remarks to generalities and made them as brief as possible. Then the body was borne to the little graveyard a mile away, followed by the state carriage, containing the three nieces and Kenneth, the drag with Silas Watson and Uncle John, the former driving, and then came the Elmhurst carryall with the servants. James did not join these last, nor did he appear at the house after that dreadful scene in the garden. He had a little room over the tool house, which Jane Merrick had had prepared for him years ago, and here he locked himself in day and night, stealthily emerging but to secure the food Susan carried and placed before his door. No one minded James much, for all the inmates of Elmhurst were under severe and exciting strain in the days preceding the funeral. The girls wept a little, but it was more on account of the solemnity following the shadow of death than for any great affection they bore their aunt. Patsy, indeed, tried to deliver a tribute to Aunt Jane's memory, but it was not an emphatic success. "I'm sure she had a good heart," said the girl, "and if she had lived more with her own family and cultivated her friends, she would have been much less hard and selfish. At the last, you know, she was quite gentle." "I hadn't noticed it," remarked Beth. "Oh, I did. And she made a new will, after that awful one she told us of, and tried to be just and fair to all." "I'm glad to hear that," said Louise. "Tell us, Patsy, what does the will say? You must know all about it." "Mr. Watson is going to read it after the funeral," replied the girl, "and then you will know as much about it as I do. I mustn't tell secrets, my dear." So Louise and Beth waited in much nervous excitement for the final realizations of their hopes or fears, and during the drive to the cemetery there was little conversation in the state carriage. Kenneth's sensitive nature was greatly affected by the death of the woman who had played so important a part in the brief story of his life, and the awe it inspired rendered him gloomy and silent. Lawyer Watson had once warned him that Miss Merrick's death might make him an outcast, and he felt the insecurity of his present position. But Patsy, believing he would soon know of his good fortune, watched him curiously during the ride, and beamed upon him as frequently as her own low spirits would permit. "You know, Ken," she reminded him, "that whatever happens, we are always to remain friends." "Of course," replied the boy briefly. The girl had thrown aside her crutches by this time, and planned to return to her work immediately after the funeral. The brief services at the cemetery being concluded, the little cavalcade returned to Elmhurst, where luncheon was awaiting them. Then Mr. Watson brought into the drawing room the tin box containing the important Elmhurst papers in his possession, and having requested all present to be seated, he said: "In order to clear up the uncertainty that at present exists concerning Miss Merrick's last will and testament, I will now proceed to read to you the document, which will afterward be properly probated according to law." There was no need to request their attention. An intense stillness pervaded the room. The lawyer calmly unlocked the tin box and drew out the sealed yellow envelope which Miss Merrick had recently given him. Patsy's heart was beating with eager expectancy. She watched the lawyer break the seal, draw out the paper, and then turn red and angry. He hesitated a moment, and then thrust the useless document into its enclosure and cast it aside. "Is anything wrong?" asked the girl, in a low whisper, which was yet distinctly heard by all. Mr. Watson seemed amazed. Jane Merrick's deceitful trickery, discovered so soon after her death, was almost horrible for him to contemplate. He had borne much from this erratic woman, but had never believed her capable of such an act. So he said in irritable tones: Miss Merrick gave me this document a few days ago, leading me to believe it was her last will. I had prepared it under her instruction, and understood that it was properly signed. But she has herself torn off and destroyed the signature and marked the paper void, so that the will previously made is the only one that is valid." "What do you mean?" cried Patsy in amazement. "Isn't Kenneth to inherit Elmhurst after all?" "Me? Me inherit?" exclaimed the boy. "That is what she promised me," declared Patsy, while tears of indignation stood in her eyes. "I saw her sign it myself, and if she has fooled me and destroyed the signature she's nothing but an old fraud, and I'm glad she's dead." With this she threw herself sobbing upon a sofa, and Louise and Beth, shocked to learn that after all their cousin had conspired against them, forbore any attempt to comfort her. But Uncle John, fully as indignant as Patricia, came to her side and laid a hand tenderly on the girl's head. "Never mind, little one," he said. "Jane was always cruel and treacherous by nature, and we might have expected she'd deceive her friends even in death. But you did the best you could, Patsy dear, and it can't be helped now." Meantime the lawyer had been fumbling in the box, and now drew out the genuine will. "Give me your attention, please," said he. Patsy sat up and glared at him. "I won't take a cent of it!" she exclaimed. "Be silent!" demanded the lawyer sternly. "You have all, I believe, been told by Miss Merrick of the terms of this will, which is properly signed and attested. But it is my duty to read it again, from beginning to end, and I will do so." Uncle John smiled when his bequest was mentioned, and Beth frowned. Louise, however, showed no sign of disappointment. There had been a miserable scramble for this inheritance, she reflected, and she was glad the struggle was over. The $5,000 would come in handy after all, and it was that much more than she had expected to have before she received Aunt Jane's invitation. Perhaps she and her mother would use part of it for a European trip, if their future plans seemed to warrant it. "As far as I am concerned," said Patsy defiantly, "you may as well tear up this will too. I won't have that shameful old woman's money." "That is a matter the law does not allow you to decide," returned the lawyer calmly. "You will note the fact that I am the sole executor of the estate, and must care for it in your interests until you are of age. Then it will be turned over to you to do as you please with." "Can I give it away if I want to?" "Certainly. It is now yours without recourse, and although you cannot dispose of it until you are of legal age, there will be nothing then to prevent your transferring it to whomsoever you please. I called Miss Merrick's attention to this fact when you refused to accept the legacy." "What did she say?" "That you would be more wise then, and would probably decide to keep it." Patsy turned impulsively to the boy. "Kenneth," she said, "I faithfully promise in the presence of these witnesses to give you Elmhurst and all Aunt Jane's money as soon as I am of age." "Good for you, Patsy," said Uncle John. The boy seemed bewildered. "I don't want the money. Really I don't," he protested. "The $5,000 she left me will be enough. But I'd like to live here at Elmhurst for a time, until it's sold or someone else comes to live in the house." "It's yours," said Patsy, with a grand air. "You can live here forever." Mr. Watson seemed puzzled. "If that is your wish, Miss Patricia," bowing gravely in her direction, "I will see that it is carried out. Although I am, in this matter, your executor, I shall defer to your wishes as much as possible." "Thank you," she said, and then, after a moment's reflection, she added, "Can't you give to Louise and Beth the $10,000 they were to have under the other will, instead of the $5,000 each that this one gives them?" "I will consider that matter," he replied. "Perhaps it can be arranged." Patsy's cousins opened their eyes at this, and began to regard her with more friendly glances. To have 10,000 each instead of 5 would be a very nice thing indeed, and Miss Patricia Doyle had evidently become a young lady whose friendship it would pay to cultivate. If she intended to throw away the inheritance, a portion of it might fall to their share. They were expressing to Patsy their gratitude when old Donald suddenly appeared in the doorway and beckoned to Uncle John. "Will you please come to see James, sir?" he asked. "The poor fellow's dying." End of Chapter 21. Recording by Patty Cunningham. Two of Aunt Jane's Nieces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patty Cunningham. Aunt Jane's Nieces by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 22. James Tells a Strange Story. Uncle John followed the coachman up the stairs to the little room above the tool house, where the old man had managed to crawl after old Sam had given him a vicious kick in the chest. "Is he dead?" he asked. "No, sir, but mortally hurt, I'm thinkin'. It must have happened while we were at the funeral." He opened the door, outside which Susan and Oscar watched with frightened faces, and led John Merrick into the room. James lay upon his bed with closed eyes. His shirt above the breast was reeking with blood. "The doctor should be sent for," said Uncle John. "He'll be here soon, for one of the stable boys rode to fetch him. But I thought you ought to know at once, sir." "Quite right, Donald." As they stood there the wounded man moved and opened his eyes, looking from one to the other of them wonderingly. Finally he smiled. "Ah, it's Donald," he said. "Yes, old friend," answered the coachman. "And this is Mr. John." "Mr. John? Mr. John? I don't quite remember you, sir," with a slight shake of the grey head. "And Donald, lad, you've grown wonderful old, somehow." "It's the years, Jeems," was the reply. "The years makes us all old, sooner or later." The gardener seemed puzzled, and examined his companions more carefully. He did not seem to be suffering any pain. Finally he sighed. "The dreams confuse me," he said, as if to explain something. "I can't always separate them, the dreams from the real. Have I been sick, Donald?" "Yes, lad, you're sick now." The gardener closed his eyes and lay silent. "Do you think he's sane?" whispered Uncle John. "I do, sir. He's sane for the first time in years." James looked at them again, and slowly raised his hand to wipe the damp from his forehead. "About Master Tom," he said falteringly. "Master Tom's dead, ain't he?" "Yes, Jeems." "That was real, then, and no dream. I mind it all now, the shriek of the whistle, the crash, and the screams of the dying. Have I told you about it, Donald?" "No, lad." "It all happened before we knew it. I was on one side the car, and Master Tom on the other. My side was on top when I came to myself, and Master Tom was buried in the rubbish. God knows how I got him out, but I did. Donald, the poor master's side was crushed in, and both legs splintered. I knew at once he was dying, when I carried him to the grass and laid him down. And he knew it too. Yes, the master knew he was done. And him so young and happy, and just about to be married to the name escapes me, lad." His voice sank to a low mumble, and he closed his eyes wearily. The watchers at his side stood still and waited. It might be that death had overtaken the poor fellow. But no, he moved again, and opened his eyes, continuing his speech in a stronger tone. "It was hard work to get the paper for Master Tom," he said. "But he swore he must have it before he died. I ran all the way to the station house and back, a mile or more, and brought the paper, and a pen and ink besides. It was but a telegraph blank, all I could find. Naught but a telegraph blank, lad." Again his voice trailed away into a mumbling whisper. But now Uncle John and Donald looked into one another's eyes with sudden interest. "He mustn't die yet," said the little man, and the coachman leaned over the wounded form and said distinctly, "Yes, lad, I'm listening." "To be sure," said James, brightening a bit. "So I held the paper for him, and the brakeman supported Master Tom's poor body, and he wrote out the will as clear as may be." "The will?" "Sure enough, Master Tom's last will. Isn't my name on it too, where I signed it? And the conductor's beside it, for the poor brakeman didn't dare let him go. Of course, who should sign the will with Master Tom but me, his old servant and friend. Am I right, Donald?" "Yes, lad." "Now," says Master Tom, "take it to Lawyer Watson, James, and bid him care for it. And give my love to Jane." "That's the name, Donald, the one I thought I'd forgot." "And now lay me back and let me die," his very words, Donald. And we laid him back, and he died. And he died. Poor Master Tom. Poor, poor young master. And him to be married in. "The paper, James!" cried Uncle John, recalling the dying man to the present. "What became of it?" "Sir, I do not know you," answered James suspiciously. "The paper's for Lawyer Watson. It's he alone shall have it." "Here I am, James!" cried the lawyer, thrusting the others aside and advancing to the bed. "Give me the paper. Where is it? I am Lawyer Watson." The gardener laughed, a horrible, croaking laugh that ended with a gasp of pain. "You, Lawyer Watson?" he cried a moment later in taunting tones. "Why, you old fool, Cy Watson's as young as Master Tom, as young as I am. You, Lawyer Watson? Ha, ha, ha!" "Where is the paper?" demanded the lawyer fiercely. James stared at him an instant, and then suddenly collapsed and fell back inert upon the bed. "Have you heard all?" asked John Merrick, laying his hand on the lawyer's shoulder. "Yes, I followed you here as soon as I could. Tom Bradley made another will as he lay dying. I must have it, Mr. Merrick." "Then you must find it yourself," said Donald gravely, "for James is dead." The doctor, arriving a few minutes later, verified the statement. It was evident that the old gardener, for years insane, had been so influenced by Miss Merrick's death that he had wandered into the stables, where he received his death blow. When he regained consciousness, the mania had vanished, and in a shadowy way he could remember and repeat that last scene of the tragedy that had deprived him of his reason. The story was logical enough, and both Mr. Watson and John Merrick believed it. "Tom Bradley was a level-headed fellow until he fell in love with your sister," said the lawyer to his companion. "But after that he would not listen to reason, and perhaps he had a premonition of his own sudden death, for he made a will bequeathing all he possessed to his sweetheart. I drew up the will myself, and argued against the folly of it, but he had his own way. Afterward, in the face of death, I believe he became more sensible and altered his will." "Yet James's story may be all the effect of a disordered mind," said Uncle John. "I do not think so; but unless he has destroyed the paper in his madness, we shall be able to find it among his possessions." With this idea in mind, Mr. Watson ordered the servants to remove the gardener's body to a room in the carriage house, and as soon as this was done he set to work to search for the paper, assisted by John Merrick. "It was a telegraph blank," he said. "Yes. Then we cannot mistake it, if we find any papers at all," declared the lawyer. The most likely places in James's room for anything to be hidden were a small closet, in which were shelves loaded with odds and ends, and an old clothes chest that was concealed underneath the bed. This last was first examined, but found to contain merely an assortment of old clothing. Having tossed these in a heap upon the floor, the lawyer began an examination of the closet, the shelves promising well because of several bundles of papers they contained. While busy over these, he heard Uncle John say quietly, "I've got it." The lawyer bounded from the closet. The little man had been searching the pockets of the clothing taken from the chest, and from a faded velvet coat he drew out the telegraph blank. "Is it the will?" asked the lawyer eagerly. "Read it yourself," said Uncle John. Mr. Watson put on his glasses. "Yes, this is Tom Bradley's handwriting, sure enough. The will is brief, but it will hold good in law. Listen. I bequeath to Jane Merrick, my affianced bride, the possession and use of my estate during the term of her life. On her death all such possessions, with their accruement, shall be transferred to my sister, Catherine Bradley, if she then survives, to have and to hold by her heirs and assignees for ever. But should she die without issue previous to the death of Jane Merrick, then I appoint my friend and attorney, Silas Watson, to distribute the property among such organized and worthy charities as he may select. That is all." "Quite enough," said Uncle John, nodding approval. "And it is properly signed and witnessed. The estate is Kenneth's, sir, after all, for he is the sole heir of his mother, Catherine Bradley Forbes." "Hurrah!" ended the lawyer, waving the yellow paper above his head. "Hurrah!" echoed Uncle John gleefully, and the two men shook hands. End of chapter 22. Recording by Patty Cunningham.
Of Aunt Jane's Nieces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BJ. Chapter 23. Patsy Adopts an Uncle. Uncle John and Mr. Watson did not appear at dinner, being closeted in the former's room. This meal, however, was no longer a state function, being served by the old servants as a mere matter of routine. Indeed, the arrangements of the household had been considerably changed by the death of its mistress, and without any real head to direct them, the servants were patiently waiting the advent of a new master or mistress. It did not seem clear to them yet whether Miss Patricia or Lawyer Watson was to take in charge of Elmhurst, but there were few tears shed for Jane Merrick, and the new regime could not fail to be an improvement over the last. At dinner, the young folks chatted together in a friendly and eager manner concerning the events of the day. They knew of old James's unfortunate end, but being unaware of its import, gave it but passing attention. The main subject of conversation was Aunt Jane's surprising act in annulling her last will, and forcing Patricia to accept the inheritance when she did not want it. Kenneth, being at ease when alone with the three cousins, protested that it would not be right for Patsy to give him all the estate, but as she was so generous, he would accept enough of his Uncle Tom's money to educate him as an artist and provide for himself an humble home. Louise and Beth, having at last full knowledge of their cousin's desire to increase their bequests, were openly very grateful for her goodwill, although secretly they could not fail to resent Patsy's choice of the boy as the proper heir of his uncle's fortune. The balance of power seemed to be in Patricia's hands, however, so it would be folly at this juncture to offend her. Altogether, they were all better provided for than they had feared would be the case, so the little party spent a pleasant evening and separated early. Beth and Louise to go to their rooms and canvass quietly the events of the day, and the boy to take a long stroll through the country lanes to cool his bewildered brain. Patsy wrote a long letter to the Major, telling him that she would be home in 3 days, and then she went to bed and slept peacefully. After breakfast, they were all summoned to the drawing-room to their great surprise. Lawyer Watson and Uncle John were there, looking as grave as the important occasion demanded, and the former at once proceeded to relate the scene in James's room, his story of the death of Thomas Bradley, and the subsequent finding of the will. This will, which has just been recovered, continued the lawyer impressively, was made subsequent to the one under which Jane Merrick inherited, and therefore supersedes it. Miss Jane had, as you perceive, a perfect right to use of the estate during her lifetime, but no right whatever to will a penny of it to anyone, Mr. Bradley having provided for that most fully. For this reason, the will I read to you yesterday is of no effect, and Kenneth Forbes inherits from his uncle through his mother all of the estate. Blank looks followed Mr. Watson's statement. "Good-bye to my 5,000, said Uncle John with his chuckling laugh, "but I'm much obliged to Jane, nevertheless." "Don't we get anything at all?" asked Beth with quivering lip. "No, my dear," answered the lawyer gently. "Your aunt owned nothing to give you." Patsy laughed. She felt wonderfully relieved. "Wasn't I the grand lady, though, with all the fortune I never had?" she cried merrily. "But 'twas really fine to be rich for a day, and toss the money around as if I didn't have to dress 10 heads of hair in 10 hours to earn my bread and butter." Louise smiled. "It was all a great farce," she said. "I shall take the afternoon train to the city. What an old fraud our dear Aunt Jane was, and how foolish of me to return her $100 check." "I used mine," said Beth bitterly. "It's all I'll ever get, it seems." And then the thought of the professor and his debts overcame her, and she burst into tears. The boy sat doubled within his chair, so overcome by the extraordinary fortune that had overtaken him that he could not speak, nor think even clearly as yet. Patsy tried to comfort Beth. "Never mind, dear," said she. "We're no worse off than before we came, are we? And we had a nice vacation. Let's forget all the disappointments, and be grateful to Aunt Jane's memory. As far as she knew, she tried to be good to us." "I'm going home today," said Beth, angrily drying her eyes. "We'll all go home," said Patsy cheerfully. "For my part," remarked Uncle John in a grave voice, "I have no home." Patsy ran up and put her arm around his neck. Poor Uncle John! Why, you're worse off than any of us. What's going to become of you, I wonder?" "I'm wondering that myself," said the little man meekly. "Ah, you can stay here," said the boy, suddenly aroused from his apathy. "No," replied Uncle John. "The Merricks are out of Elmhurst now, and it returns to its rightful owners. You owe me nothing, my lad." "But I like you," said Kenneth, "and you're old and homeless. Stay at Elmhurst, and you shall always be welcome." Uncle John seemed greatly affected and wrung the boy's hand earnestly, but he shook his head. "I've wandered all my life," he said. "I can wander yet." "See here!" exclaimed Patsy. "We're all three your nieces, and we'll take care of you between us, won't we, girls?" Louise smiled rather scornfully, and Beth scowled. "My mother and I live so simply in our little flat," said one, "that we really haven't any extra room to keep a cat. But we shall be glad to assist Uncle John as far as we are able." "Father can hardly support his own family," said the other, "but I will talk to my mother about Uncle John when I get home and see what she says." "Oh, you don't need to, indeed," cried Patsy in great indignation. "Uncle John is my dear mother's brother, and he's to come and live with the Major and me as long as he cares to. There's room to spare, Uncle," turning to him and clasping his hand, "and a joyful welcome in the bargain. No, no, say nothing at all, sir. Come you shall, if I have to drag you, and if you act naughty, I'll send for the Major to punish you." Uncle John's eyes were moist. He looked at Patsy most affectionately, and cast a wink at Lawyer Watson, who stood silently by. "Thank you, my dear," said he, "but where's the money to come from?" "Money? Bosh!" she said. "Doesn't the Major earn a heap with his bookkeeping, and haven't I had a raise lately? Why, we'll be as snug and contented as pigs in clover. Can you get ready to come with me today, Uncle John?" "Yes," he said slowly. "I'll be ready, Patsy." So the exodus from Elmhurst took place that very day, and Beth traveled in one direction while Louise, Patsy, and Uncle John took the train for New York. Louise had a seat in the parlor car, but Patsy laughed at such an extravagance. "It's so much easier than walking," she said to Uncle John, "that the common car is good enough." And the old man readily agreed with her. Kenneth and Mr. Watson came to the station to see them off, and they parted with many mutual expressions of friendship and goodwill. Louise especially pressed an urgent invitation upon the new master of Elmhurst to visit her mother in New York, and he said he hoped to see all the girls again. They were really like cousins to him by this time. After they were all gone, he rode home on Nora's back, quite disconsolate in spite of his wonderful fortune. The lawyer, who had consented to stay at the mansion for a time, that the boy might not be lonely, had already mapped out a plan for the young heir's advancement. As he rode beside Kenneth, he said, "You ought to travel and visit the art centers of Europe, and I shall try to find a competent tutor to go with you." "Can't you go yourself?" asked the boy. The lawyer hesitated. "I'm getting old, and my clients are few and unimportant, aside from the Elmhurst interests," he said. "Perhaps I can manage to go abroad with you." "I'd like that," declared the boy, "and we'd stop in New York, couldn't we, for a time?" "Of course. Do you want to visit New York especially?" "Yes. It's a rather stupid city," said the lawyer doubtfully. "That may be," answered the boy, "but Patsy will be there, you know." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Aunt Jane's Nieces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BJ. Chapter 24. Home Again. The Major was at a station to meet them. Uncle John had shyly suggested a telegram, and Patsy had decided they could stand the expense for the pleasure of seeing the old dad sooner. The girl caught sight of him outside the gates, his face red and beaming as a poppy in bloom, and his snowy mustache bristling with eagerness. At once she dropped her bundles and flew to the Major's arms, leaving the little man in her wake to rescue her belongings and follow after. He could hardly see Patsy at all. The Major wrapped her in such an ample embrace, but by and by she escaped to get her breath, and then her eyes fell upon the meek form holding her bundles. "Oh, Dad," she cried, "here's Uncle John, who's come to live with us, and if you don't love him as much as I do, I'll make your life miserable." "On which account," said the Major, grasping the little man's hand most cordially, "I'll love Uncle John like my own brother. And surely," he added, his voice falling tenderly, "my dear Violet's brother must be my own. Welcome, sir, now and always, to our little home. It's modest, sir, but wherever Patsy is, the sun is sure to shine." "I can believe that," said Uncle John, with a nod and a smile. They boarded a car for the long ride uptown, and as soon as they were seated, Patsy demanded the story of Major's adventures with his colonel, and the old fellow rattled away with the eagerness of a boy, telling every detail in the most whimsical manner and finding something humorous in every incident. "Oh, but it was grand, Patsy," he exclaimed, "and the colonel wept on my neck when we parted and stained the collar of my best coat, and he gave me a bottle of whiskey that would make a teetotaler roll his eyes in ecstasy. 'Twas the time of my life." "And you're a dozen years younger, Major," she cried, laughing, "and fit to dig into work like a pig in clover." His face grew grave. "But how about the money, Patsy dear?" he asked. "Did you get nothing out of Jane Merrick's estate?" "Not a nickel, Dad. 'Twas the best joke you ever knew. I fought with Aunt Jane like a pirate, and it quite won her heart. When she died, she left me all she had in the world." "Look at that now," said the Major wonderingly. "Which turned out to be nothing at all," continued Patsy, "for another will was found made by Mr. Thomas Bradley, which gave the money to his own nephew after Aunt Jane died. Did you ever?" "Wonderful," said the Major with a sigh. "So I was rich for half a day, and then poor as ever." "It didn't hurt you, did it?" asked the Major. "You weren't vexed with disappointment, were you, Patsy?" "Not at all, Daddy." "Then don't mind it, child. Like as not the money would be the ruination of us all. Eh, sir?" appealing to Uncle John. "To be sure," said the little man. "Jane left 5,000 to me also, which I didn't get, but I'm not sorry at all." "Quite right, sir," approved the Major sympathetically, "although it's easier not to expect anything at all than to set your heart on a thing and then not get it. In your case it won't matter. Our house is yours, and there's plenty and to spare." "Thank you," said Uncle John, his face grave but his eyes merry. "Oh, Major," cried Patsy suddenly, "there's Danny Reeves' restaurant. Let's get off and have our dinner now. I'm as hungry as a bear." So they stopped the car and descended, lugging all the parcels into the little restaurant, where they were piled into a chair while the proprietor and the waiters all gathered around Patsy to welcome her home. My, how her eyes sparkled! She fairly danced for joy and ordered the dinner with reckless disregard of the bill. "Ah, but it's good to be back," said the little bohemian gleefully. "The big house at Elmhurst was grand and stately, Major, but there wasn't an ounce of love in the cupboard." "Wasn't I there?" Patsy asked Uncle John reproachfully. "True, but now you're here, and our love, Uncle, has nothing to do with Elmhurst. I'll bet a penny you liked it as little as I did." "You'd win," admitted the little man. "And now," said the girl to the smiling waiter, "a bottle of red California wine for Uncle John and the Major, and 2 real cigars. We'll be merry tonight if it bankrupts the Doyle family entirely." But after a merry meal and a good one, there was no bill at all when it was called for. Danny Reeves himself came instead and made a nice little speech, saying that Patsy had always brought good luck to the place, and this dinner was his treat to welcome her home. So the Major thanked him with gracious dignity, and Patsy kissed Danny on his right cheek, and then they went away happy and content to find the little rooms up on the second flight of the old tenement. "It's no palace," said Patsy, entering to throw down the bundles as soon as the Major unlocked the door, "but there's a cricket in the hearth, and it's your home, Uncle John, as well as ours." Uncle John looked around curiously. The place was so plain after the comparative luxury of Elmhurst, and especially of the rose chamber Patsy had occupied, that the old man could not fail to marvel at the girl's ecstatic joy to find herself in the old tenement again. There was one good-sized living room with an ancient rag carpet partially covering the floor, a sheet-iron stove, a sofa, a table, and 3 or 4 old-fashioned chairs that had probably come from a second-hand dealer. Opening from this were 2 closet-like rooms containing each a bed and a chair, with a wash-basin on a bracket shelf. On the walls were a few colored prints from the Sunday newspaper and one large and fine photograph of a grizzled old soldier that Uncle John at once decided must represent the colonel. Having noted these details, Patsy's uncle smoothed back his stubby gray hair with a reflective and half-puzzled gesture. "It's cozy enough, my child, and I thank you for my welcome," said he. "But may I inquire where on earth you expect to stow me in this rather limited establishment?" "Where? Have you no eyes, then?" she asked in astonishment. "It's the finest sofa in the world, Uncle John, and you'll sleep there like a top, with the dear colonel's old picture looking down at you to keep you safe and give you happy dreams. Where, indeed?" "Ah, I see," said Uncle John. "And you can wash in my chamber," added the Major with a grand air, "and hang your clothes on the spare hooks behind my door." "I haven't many," said Uncle John, looking thoughtfully at his red bundle. The Major coughed and turned the lamp a little higher. "You'll find the air fine and the neighborhood respectable," he said, to turn the subject. "Our modest apartments are cool in summer and warm in winter and remarkably reasonable in price. Patsy gets our breakfast on the stove yonder, and we buy our lunches downtown, where we work and then dine at Danny Reeves's place. A model home, sir, and a happy one, as I hope you find it." "I'm sure I'll be happy here," said Uncle John, taking out his pipe. "May I smoke?" "Of course, but don't spoil the lace curtains, dear," answered Patsy mischievously. And then turning to her father, she exclaimed, "Oh, Daddy, what will Uncle do all day while we're at work?" "That's as he may choose," said the Major courteously. "Couldn't we get him a job?" asked Patsy wistfully. "Not where there'll be too much work, for Uncle is old, but just to keep him out of mischief and busy. He can't hang around all day and be happy, I suppose." "I'll look around," answered the Major briskly, as if such a job was the easiest thing in the world to procure. "And meantime," said Uncle John, smiling at them, "I'll look around myself." "To be sure," agreed the Major. "Between the two of us and Patsy, we ought to have no trouble at all." There was a moment of thoughtful silence after this, and then Patsy said, "It won't matter, Uncle John, if you don't work. They'll be easy enough for all, with the Major's wages and my own." "By the by," added the Major, "if you have any money about you, which is just possible, sir, of course you'd better turn it over to Patsy to keep, and let her make you an allowance. That's the way I do. It's very satisfactory." "The Major is extravagant," exclaimed Patsy, "and if he has the money he wants to treat every man he meets." Uncle John shook his head reproachfully at the Major. "A very bad habit, sir," he said. "I acknowledge it, Mr. Merrick," responded Major, "but Patsy is fast curing me, and after all it's a wicked city to be carrying a fat pocketbook around in, as I've often observed." "My pocketbook is not exactly fat," remarked Uncle John. "But you've money, sir, for I marked you squandering it on the train," said Patsy severely. "So out with it, and we'll count up and see how much of an allowance I can make you till you get a job." Uncle John laughed and drew his chair up to the table. Then he emptied his trouser pockets upon the cloth, and Patsy gravely separated the keys and the jackknife from the coins and proceeded to count the money. $7.42, she announced. "Any more?" Uncle John hesitated a moment, and then drew from an inner pocket of his coat a thin wallet. From this, when she had received it from his hand, the girl abstracted 2 tens and 1 $5 bill, all crisp and new. "Good gracious!" she cried delightfully. "All this wealth, and you pleading poverty?" "I never said I was a pauper," returned Uncle John complacently. "You couldn't and be truthful, sir," declared the girl. "Why, this will last for ages, and I'll put it away safe and be liberal with your allowance. Let me see," pushing the coins about with her slender fingers. "You just keep the 42 cents, Uncle John. It'll do for car fare and a bit of lunch now and then, and when you get broke you can come to me." "He smokes," observed the Major significantly. "Bah, a pipe," said Patsy. "And Bull Durham is only 5 cents a bag, and a bag ought to last a week. And every Saturday night, sir, you shall have a cigar after dinner with the Major. It's our regular practice." "Thank you, Patsy," said Uncle John meekly, and gathered up his 42 cents. "You've now a home and a manager, sir, with the money in the bank of Patsy and Company, Limited," announced Major. "You ought to be very contented, sir." "I am," replied Uncle John. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of Aunt Jane's Nieces. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BJ. Chapter 25. Uncle John Acts Queerly. When Patsy and Major had both departed for work on Monday morning, Uncle John boarded a car and rode downtown also. He might have accompanied them part of the way, but feared Patsy might think him extravagant if she found him so soon breaking into the working fund of 42 cents, when she charged him to be careful of it. He seemed to be in no hurry, for it was early yet, and a few of the lower Broadway establishments were open. To pass the time he turned into a small restaurant and had coffee and a plate of cakes, in spite of the fact that Patsy had so recently prepared coffee over the sheet iron stove and bought some hot buns from a nearby bakery. He was not especially hungry, but in sipping the coffee and nibbling the cakes, he passed the best part of an hour. He smiled when he paid out 25 cents of his slender store for the refreshment. With 5 cents for the car fare, he had now but 12 cents left of the 42 Patsy had given him. Talk about the mayor's extravagance. It could not be compared to Uncle John's. Another hour was spent in looking in at the shop windows. Then, suddenly noting the time, Uncle John started down the street at a swinging pace and presently paused before a building upon which was a sign reading, Isham, Marvin and Company, Bankers and Brokers. A prosperous-looking place, it seemed, with a host of clerks busily working in various departments. Uncle John walked in, although the uniformed official at the door eyed him suspiciously. "Mr. Marvin in?" he inquired pleasantly. "Not arrived yet," said the official, who wore a big star upon his breast. "I'll wait," announced Uncle John, and sat down upon a leather-covered bench. The official strutted up and down and watched the customers who entered the bank or departed, and keeping a sharp watch on the little man upon the bench. Another hour passed. Presently Uncle John jumped up and approached the official. "Hasn't Mr. Marvin arrived yet?" he inquired sharply. "An hour ago," was the reply. "Then why didn't you let me know? I want to see him." "He's busy mornings, has to look over the mail. He can't see you yet." "Well, he will see me, and right away. Tell him John Merrick is here." "Your card, sir." "I haven't any. My name will do." The official hesitated and glanced at the little man's seedy garb and countrified air, but something in the angry glance of the shrewd eye made him fear he had made a mistake. He opened the small door and disappeared. In a moment the door burst open to allow egress to a big red-bearded man in his shirt-sleeves, who glanced around briefly and then rushed at Uncle John and shook both his hands cordially. "My dear Mr. Merrick," he exclaimed, "I'm delighted and honored to see you here. Come to my room at once. A great surprise and pleasure, sir. Thomas, I'm engaged." This last was directed at the head of the amazed porter, who, as the door slammed in his face, nodded solemnly and remarked, "Fooled again. I might 'a' known it. Drat those 'ere billionaires. Why don't they dress like decent people?" Uncle John had been advised by Patsy where to go for a good cheap luncheon, but he did not heed her admonition. Instead, he rode in a carriage beside the banker to a splendid club, where he was served with the finest dishes the chef could provide on short notice. Moreover, Mr. Marvin introduced him to several substantial gentlemen as Mr. John Merrick of Portland, and each one bowed profoundly and declared he was highly honored. Yet Uncle John seemed in no way elated by this reception. He retained his simple manner, although his face was more grave than Patsy had often seen it, and he talked with easy familiarity of preferred stocks and amalgamated interests and invested, and securities and many other queer things that the banker seemed to understand fully and to listen to with respectful deference. Then he returned to the bank for another long session together, and there were quite an eager bustle among the clerks as they stretched their necks to get a glimpse of Mr. Marvin's companion. "It's John Merrick," passed from mouth to mouth, and the uniformed official strutted from one window to another, saying, "I showed him in myself, and he came to the bank as quiet like anyone else would." But he didn't go away quietly, you may be sure. Mr. Marvin and Mr. Isham both escorted their famous client to the door, where the Marvin carriage had been ordered to be ready for Mr. Merrick's service. But Uncle John waved it aside disdainfully. "I'll walk," he said. "There's some other errands to attend to." So they shook his hand and reminded him of a future appointment and let him go this way. In a moment the great Broadway crowd had swallowed up John Merrick, and 5 minutes later he was thoughtfully gazing into a shop window again. By and by he bethought himself of the time, and took a cab uptown. He had more than 12 cents in his pocket now, beside the checkbook, which was carefully hidden away in an inside pocket, so the cost of the cab did not worry him. He dismissed the vehicle near an uptown corner and started to walk hastily towards Danny Reeves' restaurant a block away. Patsy was standing in the doorway, anxiously watching for him. "Oh, Uncle John," she cried as he strolled, "I've been really worried about you. It's such a big city, and you're a stranger. Do you know you're 10 minutes late?" "I'm sorry," he said humbly, "but it's a long way here from downtown." "Didn't you take a car?" "No, my dear." "Why, you foolish old uncle, come in at once. The Major has been terribly excited over you, and swore you should not be allowed to wander through the streets without someone to look after you. But what could we do?" "I'm all right," declared Uncle John, cordially shaking hands with Patsy's father. "Have you had a good day?" "Fine," said the Major. "They missed me at the office and were glad to have me back. And what do you think? I've got a raise." "Really?" said Uncle John, seeing it was expected of him. "For a fact. It's Patsy's doing, I've no doubt. She wheedled the firm into giving me a vacation, and now they're to pay me 12 a week instead of 10. "Is that enough?" asked Uncle John doubtfully. More than enough, sir. I'm getting old and can't earn as much as a younger man, but I'm pretty tough and mean to hold on to that 12 a week as long as possible." "What pay do you get, Patsy?" asked Uncle John. "Almost as much as Daddy. We're dreadfully rich, Uncle John, so you needn't worry if you don't strike a job yourself all at once." "Any luck today, sir?" asked the Major, tucking a napkin under his chin and beginning on the soup. Uncle John shook his head. "Of course not," said Patsy quickly. "It's too early as yet. Don't hurry, Uncle John. Except that it'll keep you busy, there's no need for you to work at all." "You're older than I am," suggested the Major, "and that makes it harder to break in. But there's no hurry, as Patsy says." Uncle John did not seem to be worrying over his idleness. He kept on questioning his brother-in-law and his niece about their labors, and afterwards related to them the sights he had seen in the shop windows. Of course, he could not eat much after a feast he had had at luncheon, and this disturbed Patsy a little. She insisted he was tired and carried her men away to the tenement rooms as soon as possible, where she installed them at a table to play cribbage until bedtime. The next day Uncle John seemed busy enough, although of course Patsy could not know what he was doing. He visited a real estate office, one thing, and then telephoned Isham, Marvin and Company, and issued a string of orders in a voice not nearly so meek and mild as it was when he was in Patsy's presence. Whenever he had undertaken required time, for all during the week he left the tenement directly the Major and the daughter had gone to the city, and bustled about until it was time to meet them for dinner at the restaurant. But he was happy and in good spirits, and enjoyed his evening game of cribbage with the Major exceedingly. "You must be nearly bankrupt by this time," said Patsy on Tuesday evening. "It's an expensive city to live in," sighed Uncle John. She gave him 50 cents of his money, and then, on Friday, 50 cents more. "After a time," she said, "you'll manage to get along with less. It's always harder to economize at first." "How about the bills?" he inquired. "Don't I pay my share of them?" "Your expenses are nothing at all," declared the Major with a wave of his hand. "But my dinners at Danny Reeves'?" "Place must cost a lot," protested Uncle John. "Surely not. Patsy has managed all that for a trifle, and the pleasure of your company more than repays for the bit of expense." On Saturday there was a pint of red wine for the 2 men, and then the weekly cigars were brought, very inexpensive ones to be sure. The first whiff he took made Uncle John cough, but the Major smoked so gracefully and with such evident pleasure that his brother-in-law clung manfully to the cigar and succeeded in consuming it to the end. "Tomorrow is the day of rest," announced Patsy, "so we'll all go for a nice walk in the parks after breakfast." "And we sleep till 8 o'clock, don't we, Patsy?" asked the Major. "Of course. And the eggs for breakfast? I bought them already, 3 for a nickel. You don't care for more than one, do you, Uncle John?" "No, my dear. It's our Sunday morning extra, an egg apiece. The Major is so fond of them. And so am I, Patsy. And now we'll have our cribbage and get to bed early. Hi-ho! But Sunday's a great day for folks that work." End of chapter 25.